Shy Girl was betrayed by her boyfriend. Then the Vampire King saved her. I never thought it would be you, Rhiannon whispered, her voice barely a tremor against the howling wind. Damien didn't look back. He adjusted the collar of his fur coat, his profile sharp and unforgiving against the jagged peaks of the Frostfell Mountains. It was never about you, Rhiannon. It was always about the price. Someone had to be the tribute to ensure the village's safety. Better the girl who never says a word than a man with a future. Then he stepped into the mist, leaving her bound and shivering on the sacrificial stone as the moon turned blood red. The cold was not a sudden strike. It was a slow, methodical invasion. It began at Rhiannon's fingertips, turning them a ghostly porcelain before creeping up her arms to settle in the marrow of her bones. She lay on the altar of the Blackwood, a slab of ancient, lichen-covered basalt that had tasted the blood of 1,000 forgotten seasons. Rhiannon had always been the quiet one in Oakhaven. She was the girl who stayed in the library until the lamps flickered out, the girl who mended the hemlines of the wealthy without asking for a copper more than she was owed. She was the girl Damien Crestfall had claimed to love. He had called her his still waters, a sanctuary from the loud, boisterous life of a merchant's son. Now she realized she wasn't his sanctuary, she was his currency. Her breath hitched, coming out in ragged, crystalline puffs. The rope around her wrists was coarse, biting into her skin every time she struggled. Damien had tied the knots himself, the same hands that had held hers during the Midsummer Festival, the same hands that had promised a ring by autumn. He had traded her to the shadows to settle his father's gambling debts and to secure his own position in the High Council. "Help," she tried to call out, but the word died in her throat. The forest didn't care. The Blackwood was a place of twisted pines and sentient silence. Legend said that the Vampire King, Alden Ravenshire, kept his court in the heart of these mountains, and that on the night of the crimson moon he claimed a soul to tether his kingdom to the mortal realm. She heard a sound, a low, rhythmic crunching of snow. It wasn't the frantic pace of an animal. It was heavy, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. Rhiannon squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of the life she was leaving behind, the smell of dried lavender in her mother's kitchen, the way the sun hit the village pond at noon. It all felt like a dream she was being forced to wake up from. The air around her suddenly changed. The wind, which had been whipping her hair into a tangled mess, went dead still. A scent drifted toward her, not the rot of death, but something ancient and intoxicating. It smelled of crushed cedar, cold rain, and a hint of something metallic, like a copper coin on the tongue. A pathetic offering, a voice vibrated through the air. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a mountain. Rhiannon forced her eyes open. Standing at the edge of the altar was a figure draped in shadows that seemed to move of their own volition. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful, clad in armor, the color of a bruised sky. His hair was as black as the ravens that circled the peaks, and his eyes, they weren't the demonic red of the stories. They were a piercing, luminescent silver, like twin moons trapped in a storm. Alden Ravenshire, the Vampire King, looked down at her. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a god who had been forgotten by his worshippers. He reached out a hand, gloved in dark leather. Rhiannon flinched, pulling back as far as the ropes would allow. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He left you," the king stated. It wasn't a question. He looked toward the path where Damien had vanished. The man with the shallow heart. He thought his debt was paid in your blood. Alden stepped closer, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He looked at the ropes, then at the tears freezing on Rhiannon's lashes. With a flick of his wrist, a blade of obsidian appeared in his hand. Rhiannon let out a small, broken sob. certain the end had come. She braced for the strike, but instead felt the sudden release of pressure. The ropes fell away, severed cleanly. "Go," Alden said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Run back to your village. Perhaps you can catch him before he reaches the gates." Rhiannon tried to sit up, but her legs were useless. The cold had progressed too far. She collapsed back onto the stone, her vision blurring at the edges. I can't," she whispered. "There is nowhere to go." The king tilted his head, watching her with a clinical curiosity. "Your heart is failing, little bird. If I leave you here, the wolves will have you by dawn. If I take you, the world will consider you dead." "I am already dead," Rhiannon said, a sudden spark of defiance flickering in her dark eyes. "He killed the girl I was. Do whatever you want." Alden Ravenshire stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something the legends never mentioned. He knelt. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a handful of winter leaves. "Then let us see," he murmured against her ear, his breath cold but strangely soothing. "If the king of the dead can find a reason for you to live." As he stepped into the darkness, the world vanished into a swirl of snow and shadow. Rhiannon drifted in and out of a feverish haze. She felt the sensation of movement, not the jarring bounce of a carriage, but a fluid, predatory glide. Occasionally, she felt the brush of velvet against her skin and the rhythmic thrum of a heartbeat that was much slower than a human's. When she finally opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was a cathedral of carved stone. Massive ribs of obsidian arched overhead, glowing with the faint, ethereal light of blue bioluminescent moss. The bed she lay on was vast, draped in furs that felt softer than anything she had ever touched. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain flared in her chest. "Easy, child of the sun. The Frostfell bite lingers long." Rhiannon turned her head. Sitting in a high-backed chair by a fireplace that roared with a strange, green-tinged flame, was a woman. She looked young, perhaps in her 20s, but her eyes held the exhaustion of centuries. She wore a gown of deep emerald, and her skin was the color of old parchment. "Who are you?" Rhiannon's voice was a dry croak. "I am Cyrilda," the woman said, rising with a grace that felt slightly unnatural. "I am the healer of this keep, and you are the first living thing to cross this threshold in 80 years. Cyrilda walked to the bedside and offered Rhiannon a silver goblet. "Drink. It is honey, willow bark, and a drop of the king's own vintage. It will mend the cracks in your spirit." Rhiannon hesitated, the stories of vampire thralls dancing in her head. But the warmth from the fire was inviting, and her thirst was a physical ache. She took a sip. It was sweet, spicy, and sent a wave of heat through her limbs that felt like a summer afternoon. "Where is he?" Rhiannon asked. "The king is in the throne room, dealing with the aftermath of your arrival," Cyrilda replied, her expression darkening slightly. "There are those in the court who do not appreciate his charity. Quintessa, in particular, believes a tribute should be treated as a tribute, not a guest." "I didn't ask to be here," Rhiannon whispered, clutching the furs to her chest. "No one asks to be in the Blackwood," Cyrilda said softly. "But here you are, and here you must stay until the moon wanes. The borders are sealed by the king's decree." As the days passed, Rhiannon's strength returned. She explored the rooms she was permitted to enter, a labyrinth of cold stone, tapestries that depicted stars no one had seen in millennia, and balconies that overlooked a kingdom of eternal winter. She saw the king only from a distance. She watched him from a high window as he stood on the battlements, his black cloak snapping in the wind. He looked like a statue carved from the mountain itself, lonely, immovable, and terrifyingly beautiful. One evening, Rhiannon found herself in the great library. It was a cavernous space, filled with scrolls and books that smelled of dust and ancient secrets. She felt at home here. The silence of the library was a familiar friend. She was reaching for a leather-bound volume on the history of the northern stars when a shadow fell over her. "You have a penchant for things that are out of your reach," the voice said. She gasped, spinning around. Alden Ravenshire stood just a few feet away. He wasn't wearing his armor now, only a simple black tunic and trousers. Without the steel, he looked more human, yet somehow more dangerous. I was just looking," she stammered, her old shyness returning like a heavy cloak. She looked at her feet, unable to meet those silver eyes. "Why do you hide your face?" he asked, stepping closer. "In my world, the weak are slaughtered. In yours, it seems they are simply taught to disappear." Rhiannon bit her lip. "It's easier to be quiet. People don't expect things from you if they don't know you're there." "And yet he saw you," Alden said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The man who left you, he saw enough to know you were valuable enough to trade." The mention of Damien felt like a physical blow. Rhiannon flinched, her eyes brimming with sudden hot tears. "He said I was his sanctuary. He said—" "He lied," Alden interrupted. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from her chin. "Look at me, Rhiannon." It was a command she couldn't refuse. She lifted her head. "The men of your world are fools," he said, his gaze searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "They see silence as emptiness. I see it as a storm waiting to break." For a moment, the air between them vibrated with an unspoken tension. Rhiannon saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not hunger, but a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. Then, the doors to the library slammed open. A tall, striking woman with hair the color of dried blood and eyes like burning coals swept into the room. This was Quintessa, the High Lady of the court. Behind her followed a man with a scarred face and a heavy broadsword, Blaine Thornwall. "Alden!" Quintessa snapped, her voice like the crack of a whip. "The borders are being probed. The humans from the valley are emboldened. They think because you took a pet, you have grown soft. They are demanding the girl be returned for justice." Alden didn't look away from Rhiannon for several seconds. When he finally turned to Quintessa, his face was a mask of ice. "Justice?" Alden asked. "Or a public execution to hide their own cowardice?" "It does not matter," Blaine growled. "If we do not hand her over, they will breach the lower pass. We are not ready for a full-scale war over a common peasant." Rhiannon felt the world tilting again. They were talking about her as if she were a piece of meat. Her heart began to race. She looked at Alden, searching for any sign of the man who had carried her through the snow. Alden walked toward Quintessa, his presence expanding, until he seemed to fill the entire room. "This girl is under my protection. Any who wish to probe my borders will find only a cold grave." "You would risk everything for this?" Quintessa pointed a long, sharp fingernail at Rhiannon. "I risk nothing," Alden said. "I am the king, and the king does not negotiate with traitors or cowards." He turned back to Rhiannon. "Go to your room. Lock the door. Do not come out until I send for you." As Rhiannon fled the library, she heard the sound of steel being drawn. The sanctuary she had found was already beginning to crumble. The sanctuary of Rhiannon's guest chambers felt more like a gilded cage as the night wore on. Outside, the wind howled with a renewed fury, and she could hear the distant, rhythmic clanging of bells, a warning signal she didn't understand. She sat by the window, watching the flickers of torchlight moving along the mountain paths. Were those Damien's people? Were they coming to save her, or to finish the job Damien had started? The thought of seeing him again made her stomach churn. with a mixture of fear and a dark, cold anger she didn't know she possessed. There was a soft knock at her door. Rhiannon. It was Serylda's voice. Rhiannon unlocked the door and let the healer in. Serylda looked frazzled, her green dress torn at the hem. She was carrying a tray with bread and a steaming bowl of broth. "Eat quickly," Serylda said. "There is trouble at the gate, a group of men from your village. They have found a way through the mist. They have a priest with them, and iron-bound relics. They are demanding you be purified." "Purified?" Rhiannon asked, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" Serylda looked away. "In their eyes, you have been tainted by the king. They believe the only way to save your soul is through fire." Rhiannon's breath hitched. Fire. She could almost see the stakes being raised in the village square. She could see Damien standing in the front row, looking solemn, acting the part of the grieving lover while her life turned to ash. "Where is Alden?" she asked. "He is at the gate. He is trying to hold them back without slaughtering them all," Serylda explained. "But Quintessa and Blaine are pushing for blood. They want to show the humans the price of trespassing." "I have to go to him," Rhiannon said, a sudden, desperate clarity taking hold of her. "No, it's too dangerous," Serylda protested. "They are here because of me," Rhiannon argued. "If I stay hidden, people will die. If I go, maybe I can—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't know what she could do. She was just a shy girl with no power. But for the first time in her life, she couldn't just be quiet. She pushed past Serylda and ran into the corridor. She followed the sound of the wind and the distant shouting, her bare feet slapping against the cold obsidian floors. She reached the great courtyard just as the massive iron gates were being forced open. A group of men, led by a tall figure she recognized instantly, marched into the torchlight. It was Damien. He looked different, more arrogant, draped in a cloak of white fur, holding a silver crucifix high. Behind him were the village elders and several men armed with pitchforks and old swords. Alden stood alone in the center of the courtyard. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He simply stood there, a dark monolith against the snow. "Return the girl, monster," Damien shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "She is a daughter of the light. You have no claim on her." "She was a daughter of the light when you bound her to a stone and left her for the wolves." Alden's voice was like a low growl of thunder. "You forfeited your claim the moment you walked away." "I did what was necessary for my people," Damien retorted. "And now I will do what is necessary to save her soul from your filth." Rhiannon stepped out from the shadows of the archway. The wind caught her hair, sending it whipping across her face. "Damien," she said. It wasn't loud, but the courtyard went silent. Damien's eyes widened. He shifted his gaze to her, and for a split second, she saw the mask slip. She saw the greed and the fear. Then, he transformed back into the hero. "Rhiannon, my love, come to me. We have come to rescue you." He reached out a hand, his face contorted into a look of feigned desperation. Rhiannon looked at his hand, the hand that had tied the knots. Then, she looked at Alden. The king was watching her, his silver eyes unreadable. He wasn't moving. He was letting her choose. "You didn't come to rescue me," Rhiannon said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "You came because you're afraid. You're afraid I'll tell them the truth. You're afraid of what you've become." "She's bewitched!" Damien cried out to the men behind him. "Look at her! She's under his spell! We must take her by force!" The men surged forward. Suddenly, the air erupted. Quintessa and Blaine leaped from the battlements, their movements a blur of lethal grace. Blaine's broadsword hummed as it sliced through the air, and Quintessa's hands glowed with a dark, violet energy. "Enough!" Alden roared. The ground beneath them shook. A wave of force radiated from him, knocking the villagers off their feet and sending Damien sprawling into the snow. Alden walked toward Damien, his eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. He stopped just inches away, looking down at the man who had betrayed everything. "I should kill you where you lie," Alden whispered. "I should let your blood stain the snow as hers almost did." "No," Rhiannon said, stepping forward. She placed a hand on Alden's arm. His muscles were like iron beneath her touch, vibrating with suppressed violence. He looked at her, the silver in his eyes swirling like a galaxy. "Don't," she said softly. "He isn't worth your soul." Alden stared at her for a long time. The anger in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning into something else, a strange, dark admiration. He looked back at Damien. "Take your hero and leave. If I see any of you on this mountain again, I will not be so merciful. The girl stays. She is no longer one of yours." Damien scrambled to his feet, his face pale with humiliation and rage. "You'll regret this, Rhiannon. You're choosing a monster." "I'm choosing the one who didn't leave me in the dark," she replied. As the villagers retreated, Damien threw one last look over his shoulder, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The gates slammed shut. Silence returned to the courtyard, broken only by the crackle of torches. Quintessa and Blaine lingered in the shadows, their eyes fixed on Rhiannon with a cold, predatory interest. Alden turned to her. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her hand, which was still resting on his arm. "You stayed," he finally said. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "You do," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But you chose to be here. That makes you more dangerous than any king." He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold, but for the first time, Rhiannon didn't shiver. "The night is far from over, Rhiannon," he murmured, "and the world will not forget you so easily." As he walked away, Rhiannon looked up at the moon. It was no longer red. It was a pale, cold white, illuminating the path she had chosen, a path into the heart of the shadow. The mornings in the Ravenshire Keep did not begin with the sun. Instead, they began with a gradual shift in the hue of the bioluminescent moss that clung to the damp, obsidian walls, a transition from a deep, midnight indigo to a soft, pearlescent violet that heralded the waking hours of the immortal court. For Rhiannon, this subtle change in light was the signal to leave the safety of her heavy furs and descend into the lower levels of the fortress, where the air grew thicker with the scent of wet stone, ancient earth, and the metallic tang of magic. She was no longer the girl who spent her days mending the hemlines of the wealthy in Oakhaven, her head bowed to avoid the wandering eyes of merchants. Here, under the patient tutelage of Cyrilda, her hands were learning a different, more dangerous kind of labor. Cyrilda was teaching her the language of the Blackwood, a tongue not of spoken words, but of textures, scents, and the rhythmic, hidden flow of sap. They worked in the glass garden, a sunless conservatory carved into a natural cavern of enchanted crystal. The walls captured the faint, distant starlight from the peaks above and amplified it until the space glowed with a soft, silver luminescence. Water trickled from stalactites into pools of obsidian dark water, and the air was alive with the hum of insects that glowed like embers. "You must listen to the pulse, Rhiannon," Cyrilda whispered, her fingers guiding Rhiannon's over the stem of a frost lily. The plant was exquisite and terrifyingly fragile, its petals as thin as a dragonfly's wing, and so cold they felt like they might sear the skin. "In your world, life is a frantic scream for attention. It is loud, hurried, and demanding. But here, in the shadow, life is a slow, patient ache. It is a secret kept for centuries. If you try to force it, If you reach for it with greed, it will shatter into ice. Rhiannon closed her eyes, letting the silence of the garden settle into her bones. She felt the coolness of the moss beneath her knees, and the faint, subsonic vibration of the mountain itself. The mountain's heartbeat. She thought of Damien. His love had always felt like a demand, a bright, loud noise she was expected to harmonize with. He had wanted her to be his sanctuary, yet he never cared to know the architecture of her soul. Alden's world, by contrast, was a cavernous, respectful silence. It was a space that didn't demand she be anything other than what she was. As she concentrated on the flower, a faint, rhythmic warmth began to radiate from her fingertips. It wasn't the heat of a fire, but the warmth of a sun-warmed stone. To her amazement, the frost lily, which had been tightly curled against the mountain chill, began to unfurl. Its silver-veined leaves trembled as they reached toward her palms, basking in the strange, internal light she didn't know she possessed. "You have the touch," Serilda remarked, her voice holding a rare, tremulous note of genuine surprise. She pulled back her hand, watching as the lily bloomed into a star-shaped crown of white light. Most humans wither these things just by breathing on them. Their spirits are too agitated. But you are not taking from the earth. You are offering yourself to it. You aren't afraid of the quiet. "I spent my whole life trying to be invisible," Rhiannon said softly, her eyes remaining fixed on the glowing flower. She felt a strange kinship with the plant. It only bloomed when it felt safe in the dark. People in the village used to say my shyness was a weakness. They said I was empty because I didn't speak. Maybe the plants don't see me as a threat, because they know I don't want to own them. I just want them to be allowed to exist. "The king was the same," Serilda said, her expression softening into a look of profound melancholy. She began to prune a nearby ghost orchid with a silver knife. Before the final stage of the curse took its hold on his heart, he spent more time here than in the throne room. He used to say that the earth remembers everything, every drop of blood, every fallen tear, even when the heart tries to forget. He used to sit by the pool and watch the orchids bloom for hours. He was a man of great, profound peace once, a man who protected the forest because he loved its silence. "What happened to him, Serilda?" Rhiannon asked, her voice a mere breath. "Why does the court whisper of him, as if he's a storm about to break? Why does he carry the weight of a world on his shoulders?" Before the healer could answer, the heavy crystal doors of the garden swung open with a sound like grinding ice. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. Alden Ravenshire walked in. He was stripped of his heavy plate armor, looking more human and yet more dangerous than she had ever seen him. He wore only a high-collared tunic of midnight blue velvet and trousers of dark, supple leather. Without the steel, he looked leaner, more predatory, yet undeniably weary. His black hair was slightly disheveled, and the silver crown sat low on his brow, looking more like a burden than a prize. Serilda bowed low, her green skirts rustling against the moss, and retreated into the shadows of the ferns with a quick, knowing glance at Rhiannon. She left the girl standing alone in the center of the silver light, her hand still cupping the radiant frost lily. Alden stopped a few feet away. He didn't speak at first. He looked at the lily, which was now fully bloomed and pulsing with a soft, white light that illuminated the underside of his sharp jawline. "It has been 80 years since I saw that flower open its heart," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in Rhiannon's very marrow. "I didn't do anything," she stammered, her old shyness flickering like a candle in a draught. She felt the urge to pull her hands away, to hide the light. I just waited. I let it happen." "That is exactly what you did," Alden said, stepping closer. The scent of him, Cedar, cold rain, and the metallic tang of old copper enveloped her, grounding her. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers hovering just an inch from the lily, but he didn't touch it. My touch is too cold for it now. If I reach for it with my current spirit, it will freeze into a shard of ice. My soul is too heavy for such delicate things. But you carry a spark that the Blackwood hasn't felt in an age. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting, crystalline second, the silver in his eyes wasn't a storm, but a mirror. He wasn't looking at a tribute or a peasant girl from a backwater village. He saw her, the girl who understood the weight of a secret, the girl who knew that silence was often a shield, not a void. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp need for the truth. "Because I'm different? Because I can make your flowers grow? I saved you because I recognized the look in your eyes on that altar," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a caress. He stepped into her personal space, his height towering over her. Yet, he didn't feel threatening. It was the look of someone who had been killed by the world, but who refused to stay dead. I knew that look, Rhiannon. I have worn it for a century. We are two ghosts walking through a world of the living. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, the proximity sending a jolt of electricity through her. He didn't touch her skin, as if afraid his own coldness would hurt her, but she could feel the static of his power. "The court is restless, Rhiannon," he warned, his expression hardening. "Quintessa sees your growth, your bloom, as a threat to the purity of our shadow. She thinks beauty belongs only to the immortal. Stay close to Serilda, and do not go to the battlements alone. The mountain is listening, and not everything it hears is friendly." As he turned and disappeared into the dark corridor, his shadow lingered over the frost lily for a moment longer than necessary. Rhiannon stood in the silence, a single cold tear running down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the realization that the most feared being in the kingdom was the only one who had ever truly looked at her and seen a storm worth knowing. The night of the silver solstice arrived with a sky so clear the stars looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. It was the one night of the year when the moon reached its zenith, granting the Ravenshire lineage a brief, heightened surge of power. It was also the night of the Great Oath, where the vampire lords gathered to reaffirm their loyalty to the Obsidian throne. Serilda had spent hours preparing Rhiannon. "Tonight is not about beauty, child. It is about armor," the healer said, pinning a heavy obsidian comb into Rhiannon's dark waves. The dress was a marvel of dark craftsmanship. It was made of silk so deep a black it seemed to absorb the candlelight, but its bodice and hem were embroidered with thousands of silver threads that captured the starlight, making it look as though she were draped in the night sky itself. Around her throat was a single, thin band of silver. Not a collar, but a mark of protection. "You look like a queen," Serilda whispered. "I feel like a target," Rhiannon replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. The great hall was a cathedral of ice and shadow. Hundreds of vampires moved with a fluid, predatory grace, their silks and velvets rustling like the wings of giant moths. The music was a haunting, ethereal melody, played on bone flutes and silver-stringed harps, a sound that felt more like a memory than a song. As Rhiannon entered, the room went dead silent. The social hierarchy of the Blackwood was built on power and age, and she was a human girl, a still heart in a room of hunters. She felt the weight of 1,000 predatory gazes, but she kept her head high, focusing on the throne at the far end of the hall. Alden was there, looking like a god of the underworld. He was dressed in full ceremonial armor, his black cloak lined with white fur, his silver crown gleaming. Beside him stood Quintessa, draped in crimson silk that looked like fresh, flowing blood. Quintessa stepped forward, intercepting Rhiannon before she could reach the dais. "The little bird has grown some feathers," the High Lady sneered, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "But feathers do not make a hawk. Tell me, mortal, do you truly think you belong among those who have seen empires crumble while your ancestors were still shivering in caves?" Rhiannon felt the familiar urge to shrink away, to apologize for being in the room, but she remembered the cold of the altar. She remembered Damien's betrayal. She realized that the monsters in this room were at least honest about their hunger. "I don't think I belong anywhere," Rhiannon said, her voice clear and resonant. "But the king chose me to stay. And in this court, I believe his word is the only one that matters." A soft, collective intake of breath echoed through the hall. Quintessa's eyes flashed a violent, burning red, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her silver goblet. Enough, Quintessa. Alden had descended from the throne. He didn't walk. He moved like a shadow across the stone. He stopped beside Rhiannon, his presence immediately silencing the murmurs. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a firm, grounding touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. "The girl is under my protection," Alden said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that silenced the music. "If any of you find her presence offensive, you may take it up with me. Privately." No one moved. The challenge was absolute. Alden turned to Rhiannon, his silver eyes searching hers. The music shifted, turning into a slow, rhythmic waltz that sounded like a heartbeat. "They expect a dance to open the solstice," he whispered. "Will you give them one?" "I don't know how," she admitted, her breath catching. "Just follow my lead," he said. "And don't look at them. Look only at me." They moved to the center of the floor. As they spun, the world around Rhiannon became a blur of silver light and dark velvet. Alden's movements were powerful and fluid, carrying her with an effortless strength. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the shy girl from the library. She wasn't the sacrifice. She was the center of a king's attention. "You are doing well, little bird," he murmured, his breath brushing against her ear. "I'm just trying not to step on your boots," she joked, a small, genuine smile breaking through her fear. For a brief, impossible moment, the air between them was light. The crown and the curse seemed miles away. But the moment was shattered as the massive iron doors of the hall were thrown open. Blaine Thornwall burst in, his face grim and covered in a fine layer of frost. "Alden, the lower pass has been breached. It's not just the villagers. They have iron-forged weapons and mercenaries from the southern reach. Damien Crestfall is leading them. He's carrying a banner of the Holy Order." The hall erupted in chaos. Alden let go of Rhiannon, his face instantly returning to a mask of cold obsidian. "He's coming for her," Blaine added, looking at Rhiannon with a mixture of pity and resentment. "He's told them she's a captive being tortured. He's promised them the king's head and the girl's soul." Rhiannon felt the cold return, deeper and more biting than the frost on the mountain. Damien hadn't just betrayed her once. He was using her again to fuel his own thirst for glory. In the days following the breach, the Ravenshire Keep transformed from a place of quiet beauty into a fortress of war. The rhythmic pounding of hammers from the lower forges echoed through the halls like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Armored vampires patrolled the battlements, and the scent of ozone and sharpened steel hung heavy in the air. Rhiannon sat in the great library, surrounded by ancient scrolls she could no longer focus on. She watched the snow fall outside. It was a heavy, relentless white that felt like a shroud. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said. She turned to see Alden. He was fully armored now, his black cloak draped over his broad shoulders, his hand resting on the hilt of his obsidian blade. He looked like a man who had already accepted his own end. "Where should I be?" she asked. "I'm the reason they're here. If I leave, Maybe the killing will stop. They won't stop, Alden said, walking to the window. Damien doesn't want you, Rhiannon. He wants the legend of the man who killed a king. You are just his excuse. If it wasn't you, he would have found another girl to tie to an altar. He said I was his sanctuary, she whispered. Men like him use words as masks, Alden replied, turning to look at her. He wanted to own your silence. He didn't want to hear what was inside it. He sat down across from her, his heavy armor clanking. The silver crown on his brow seemed to weigh more than it ever had before. I want you to know the truth before the battle begins, about the curse, about why I saved you. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, Rhiannon saw his hands tremble slightly. Centuries ago, my family were the guardians of this pass, but a plague came, a sickness of the blood that turned men into husks. My father made a pact with an entity older than the mountains to save our people. He traded our mortality for their lives. But there was a price, Rhiannon guessed. The price was a hunger that never ends, and a heart that can never truly feel the sun, Alden said. But the pact had a clause, a blood oath. It said that the line would only be broken by a willing heart that seeks nothing but the shadow's peace. For 80 years, I have searched for a tribute that was not forced. I thought it meant someone had to die for me. He reached out and took her hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm and protective. But when I saw you on that altar, I realized I was wrong. The willing heart isn't someone who wants to die. It's someone who is willing to live with the shadow, to see the man beneath the monster. I am willing, Alden, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You don't know what that means, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If the oath is broken, the power of this house ends. We become mortal again. We become vulnerable. Before Rhiannon could respond, a horn blasted from the battlements, a long, low note that signaled an imminent attack. They are at the gates, Alden said, rising. Alden, she called out as he turned to leave. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Don't die for a crown, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. Fight for the man who saw me in the dark. He looked at her for a long moment, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I have been dead for a long time, Rhiannon. Tonight, I think I might actually find a reason to fight for life. He vanished into the corridor. Rhiannon stood by the window, her heart racing. She saw the first flickers of fire at the base of the mountain, hundreds of torches moving upward like a trail of burning ants, and leading the charge on a white horse was Damien, his silver crucifix gleaming with a false, blinding light. She knew she couldn't just wait in the library. She ran toward the stairs, heading for the king's private sanctum, where the heart of the Blackwood was kept. But as she reached the door, a cold hand clamped over her mouth, and a sharp blade of violet energy pressed against her throat. The king's charity ends tonight, little bird, Quintessa whispered into her ear, her breath like ice. And I won't let a human girl be the one to strip us of our divinity. Rhiannon was dragged into the darkness of the sanctum as the first catapult stones crashed against the walls of the keep. The air in the king's private sanctum was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. Quintessa's grip on Rhiannon's arm was like a band of freezing iron, her nails digging through the silk of the solstice dress. The High Lady dragged her toward a central dais, where a single crystalline rose was suspended in a pillar of shimmering violet light. Do you see this, little human? Quintessa hissed, her face contorted into a mask of pure malice. This is the heart of the Blackwood. It is the anchor of our immortality. As long as it pulses, we are gods. And you are the infection that seeks to wither it. Rhiannon struggled, but the violet energy radiating from Quintessa's hand made her limbs feel heavy, as if her blood had turned to lead. Alden said the oath was a curse. He wants to be free. Alden is a fool, Quintessa shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Outside, the roar of the siege grew louder, the sound of wood splintering and men screaming. He has grown weary of the hunt, of the power that comes with the shadow. He would trade his crown for a few years of warmth in your arms. But I will not let my eternity be extinguished because a shy girl learned to speak. Quintessa raised her other hand, the violet energy coiling around her fingers like a nest of vipers. The willing heart must be silenced. If the one who loves the shadow is removed, the oath remains unbroken. We stay as we are, eternal, invincible. Rhiannon looked at the crystalline rose. It didn't look like a source of power, it looked like a prison. It pulsed with a rhythmic, mournful light that matched the beat of her own heart. "You're afraid," Rhiannon said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the terror. "You're not fighting for power, Quintessa. You're fighting because you're terrified of what you'll be without the shadow. You're afraid of being human." The slap caught Rhiannon across the cheek, sending her reeling. Her lip split, the copper taste of blood filling her mouth. "I am nothing like you," Quintessa spat. She moved to strike again, but the doors to the sanctum erupted inward. Serilda stood there, her emerald gown torn and stained with soot. In her hand, she held a vial of glowing silver liquid, the nectar of the ghost orchids they had harvested in the glass garden. "Let her go, Quintessa," Serilda commanded. "The healer dares to challenge me?" Quintessa laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You who spends your days tending to weeds?" "I tend to life," Serilda replied. She threw the vial. It shattered at Quintessa's feet, releasing a cloud of luminescent mist. Quintessa shrieked as the mist touched her skin. To a human it was medicine. To a vampire who had fed on nothing but darkness for centuries, it was a searing light. She released Rhiannon, clawing at her eyes. "Run, Rhiannon!" Serilda cried out. "Go to the courtyard. The king is falling." Rhiannon didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the ache in her limbs. She ran past the blinded Quintessa, past Serilda, and down the spiraling stone stairs. Every step was a prayer. She didn't care about the crown. She didn't care about the curse. She only cared about the man who had seen a storm inside her silence. As she reached the great hall, the doors were being battered down. The smell of burning pitch and cold iron was overwhelming. The sanctuary was failing, and the night of the crimson moon was turning into a dawn of fire. The courtyard was a nightmare of silver and steel. The vampires of the court fought with a desperate, animalistic ferocity, but the invaders were prepared. Damien's mercenaries used nets of woven iron and bolts tipped with sun-blessed silver. In the center of the chaos, Alden Ravenshire was a whirlwind of shadow. His armor was dented and scarred, and a deep gash on his shoulder bled a dark, viscous ichor. He fought with a heavy obsidian blade, each swing cutting through the air with a sound like a winter gale. But he was being pushed back. Damien Crestfall stood on the upper ridge of the courtyard, flanked by archers. He wasn't fighting, he was orchestrating the slaughter. "Look at your king now!" Damien yelled, his voice carrying over the din. "A dying dog in a crumbling kennel. Rhiannon, where are you? Come out and see the monster you chose." Rhiannon stepped into the light of a nearby brazier. Her dress was ruined, her face bruised, but she stood tall. She saw Alden turn his head at the sound of Damien's voice, his silver eyes finding hers amidst the carnage. "Rhiannon, go back!" he roared, but a mercenary's pike caught him in the side, forcing him to his knees. "No!" she screamed. She ran across the courtyard, dodging the clash of blades. She didn't have a sword. She didn't have magic, but she had the knowledge Serilda had given her. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a handful of sun-dried thorns from the blackwood, the ones that caused temporary paralysis. As a mercenary lunged at the kneeling king, Rhiannon threw the thorns with a desperate, practiced motion. They struck the man's exposed neck. He faltered, his limbs locking as he collapsed into the snow. She reached Alden, throwing her arms around his neck, shielding him with her own body. "Kill them both!" Damien shouted from the ridge. "She's a thrall! She's no longer human!" The archers raised their bows. Alden wrapped his good arm around Rhiannon, pulling her tight against his chest. He was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer effort of staying upright. "Why did you come?" he whispered against her hair. "I told you to stay hidden." "You said I was the willing heart," she replied, her voice muffled by his armor. "I am willing, Alden, but I'm not willing to let you go." The archers released their string. A dozen silver-tipped arrows hissed through the air. Suddenly, the wind died. The fire in the braziers turned from orange to a brilliant, blinding white. The arrows froze in mid-air, as if the very fabric of time had snagged on a thorn. The crystalline rose from the sanctum appeared above the courtyard, floating in the sky like a second miniature moon. It wasn't suspended by Quintessa's magic now. It was responding to the resonance of the two hearts below it. The willing heart had found its shadow's peace. A shockwave of pure, white light radiated from the rose. It didn't burn. It felt like the first touch of spring after a 1,000-year winter. The mercenaries were thrown back, their iron weapons shattering into dust. The vampires of the court fell to their knees, gasping as the heavy, suffocating hunger that had defined their existence for centuries suddenly vanished. Damien fell from the ridge, tumbling into the snow. He scrambled to his feet, his silver crucifix now a blackened piece of lead. He looked at Rhiannon and Alden, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "What have you done?" he hissed. "This isn't how it ends. The hero kills the beast." "There are no heroes here, Damien," Rhiannon said, stepping away from Alden. She walked toward the man who had once been her world. "Only people who love and people who use. You never knew the difference." Alden stood up, his wounds closing as the white light worked its ancient medicine. He didn't pick up his sword. He just watched her. Damien pulled a small, hidden dagger from his boot, a final, desperate attempt at spite. He lunged at Rhiannon, but the blackwood itself intervened. The ancient pines at the edge of the courtyard groaned, their roots erupting from beneath the snow like giant wooden fingers. They coiled around Damien's legs, dragging him down into the earth he had sought to conquer. "Rhiannon, save me!" he cried out, his eyes wide with a genuine terror he couldn't fake. She looked at him for a long moment. She saw the boy she had once loved, and the man who had traded her for a future. "I already did," she said softly. "I saved myself." The earth closed over Damien Crestfall, leaving nothing but a smooth patch of snow. The silence that followed was absolute. The soldiers had fled, the court had dispersed into the shadows of the keep, and the sun began to peek over the jagged edges of the Frostfell Mountains. Rhiannon turned back to Alden. He was standing in the center of the courtyard, his silver armor now reflecting the first rays of dawn. He looked at his hands, then at the sky. He didn't burst into flame. He didn't turn to ash. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's gone." "The oath is broken," Rhiannon said, her heart full of a strange, soaring lightness. "The shadow has found its peace." Alden walked toward her. His skin was no longer the deathly pale of a vampire. It held the faint, warm glow of life. He reached out and touched her cheek, not with restraint this time, but with a lingering, tender wonder. His hand was warm. "You gave up your immortality," she said. "I gave up a prison," he replied. "I would rather have 50 years with you than 10,000 in that silence." He looked around at the ruined keep, at the glass garden that was now bathed in real sunlight, and at the blackwood that seemed to be breathing a sigh of relief. "We cannot stay here," he said. The world will still fear what we were. And the court, those who survived, will need to find a new way to live. Then let's go, Rhiannon said. To the south, beyond the mountains, to a place where no one knows the names Crestfall or Ravenshire. You would leave everything? He asked. Your home? Your village? I found my home on an altar in the dark, she said. The rest is just geography. Alden smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his silver eyes. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the kiss of a monster or a king. It was the kiss of a man who had finally been found. They left as the snow began to melt, turning the mountain paths into singing streams. Rhiannon and Alden walked hand in hand, two figures moving toward a horizon that was no longer painted in blood and shadow. The shy girl who had been betrayed had not just been saved. She had been the savior. She had learned that silence is not a void, but a reservoir of strength, and that love is not a transaction, but a transformation. Behind them, the Ravenshire Keep stood as a monument to a forgotten age, its obsidian walls slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The Blackwood was no longer a place of fear, but a sanctuary of whispers, telling the tale of the king who chose his heart over his crown. They stepped into the sunlight, free of the curse, free of the past, and bound only by a destiny they had written for themselves in the snow. If you loved this tale of shadows, sacrifice, and the power of a quiet heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic romances. Join our community to decide which destiny we explore next.